Firstly, I just think it's really worth taking a moment to just recognize how incredible it is to be here, both in this context, but also in the care that's been set up for all of us to be here. It's so easy to take this world for granted in terms of the pleasure and the quality and the care of every moment. So I just want to start by fully acknowledging that, and Stephanie and the team for bringing us here with so much care and love. So thank you so much for that. Look, second point I would want to make before I get into this is I'm not saying truths, or I'm not trying to say a truth. I'm going to give you an opinion, and hopefully it's merely a provocation to allow us to have better conversations and make us all smarter. That's my objective. It's not that I hold some kind of oracle-like quality at all. In fact, I'm sure there's many errors, and I would like me to get smarter, and like all of us to get smarter together over the course of these days. There are incredible people in the room, so I'm merely a foil for your brilliance. Let's just keep that. But I do want to rock in this. I do want to drive some conversations that I think are really, for me, becoming really critical. One is the gap between what I would call a delusionary hope. And this is the hope where we say, well, you just gotta, Indy, you can't say that because you just gotta keep people hope. That to me is a delusionary hope. It's like, well, 5% reduction in carbon, at least we're reducing something, when you got a 95% problem. This to me is a delusionary hope. And I think we have to become very mindful of this delusionary hope, because I think it's actually quite systemically auto-destructive. And I think my one invitation is, how do we start to embrace the hard scale of the challenge ahead of us? And this is an invitation not to scare us, but an invitation to actually invite our greatness. That is my genuine invitation here. We're going to go through I'm going to do this quite quickly. There's lots of things to talk about. One, recognizing we are currently still on, at a conservative level, but to 2.7 to 3.1 degrees temperature at a policy level, not actual, not if you look at actual CO2 emissions, not if you look at any tipping points being achieved. We are at a conservative level. We're at targeting 2.7 to 3.1 degrees. Those numbers are like just numbers, but when you start to put them into ground, what do they really mean? 3 degrees global average temperature rise, excluding the fact we've lost one of our global food baskets in the world at 1.79 degrees. So I'm not even talking about any of those things. 3 degrees means 5 degrees land temperature rise. It means 8 degrees urban temperature rise on average. 8 degrees urban temperature rise. So places like London will be typically feeling 40-degree temperatures at a consistent level in summer. 40 degrees. Now, I want us to talk about this because I often get into rooms with retrofit conversations, and people say to me, we got to deal with the heat load. And I was like, mate, we've got to worry about the cooling load, because cooling is much more difficult than heating, in fact, when you start to actually try to deliver it. So let's start to talk about the kind of reality, and then these figures. Now, I want to bring this here because this is done by The Economist. It looks at 2 degrees to 2.7 degrees, 2.5 degrees above pre-industrial temperature rise. All those red zones are outside historic human habitable zones. You're already seeing these effects around the world, but when people talk about 1.2 billion people on the move, they're referring to this. They're referring to this in a context where, when we talk about future urbanism, what does future urbanism mean in that context? And I think there's a real invitation to start to think, and these are not far-flung futures now. They're actually within our organizational impacts, within our infrastructure lifetimes that we're allocating to. So these are futures to which we're allocating into. Next, language. Climate breakdown rather than climate change. It's my other provocation. Climate is the idea of predictable weather, and what we're losing is predictability of weather, And what we're losing also is the loss of predictability, which means the loss of insurability. This is happening around the world right now, and thereby we're going to lose our capital markets unless they're going to be insured, as we're starting to see fundamentally reinsurance by governments. Governments are coming in as last insurers right now. So when we start to move this chain, let me give you an example. I think 70% of transactions in New York are cash transactions right now. They're not mortgages, they're not finance, they're cash transactions. When we start to move into this world, we're going to create an accelerator of inequality where assets will only be able to be bought by those that actually have wealth and are able to leverage their wealth. Disasters and volatility will massively increase wealth concentration. That's been the historic precedence on this stuff. How do we start to deal with that? And the social tipping points are way in advance of our climate tipping points, environmental tipping points. So we are accelerating some of those things much more fast. Next, again, look at the underlyings. And this worries me a lot, that actually you've got politicians talking about 2 to 3% GDP growth. What that really means is a 25% doubling of our energy and material environments over the next 25 years. That's what 2 to 3% GDP growth means. Doubling of our material. And for all the likes of delaminating material, GDP, and energy, it's marginal, even in the top. So UK, US, it's marginal, that delamination that we're seeing. So we've got some underlying issues that are on the table. Next. And again, I'm talking more fundamentals here, just quickly going through them. Copper is the thing we should be talking about a lot. Copper, used to have ore which was 40% copper, it went to 4%, and it's down to 0.4%. How we dealt with that was having massive trucks, oversized trucks, driven by hydrocarbon energy systems, and reliant on hydrocarbon because we have no alternative to the energy density of hydrocarbon for mining right now. No alternative. So we've been dealing with effectively a mining, are available, there's loads of copper in the world, but the density of copper is decreasing. So if it's 0.4%, which means you have to dig 1,000 tons to get 1 ton, right? That's what starts to happen. Now, we have a 600% increase in our mineral demands between 2050, between our current to 600%. That's the demand side. Now factor that in the constraints that are happening. Then factor this in, and the reason why I'm saying this, every city we're talking to is talking about electrification. Every city we're talking to, right? And when you start to look at the constraint systems, you start to look at some of those. 90% of our biodiversity losses are rooted in mining and mineral economy. So my provocation for the next forum is we should be talking about the new economy that roots some of this stuff, and that's already on the table. Then let's talk about the fundamentals. How many people here are vegan? 1, 2, come on, more hands. If you're not shy. Now the reason why I say that, right, I didn't put my hand up, right? So this is not a moral problem, but I want us to recognize our own Trump-like behaviors, right? We always accuse other people, but the facts are like that, right? All the wild animals in the world are those green dots, right? So when we talk about substantive transformation, we're going to have to change our land use economy. I'm not talking about food. I'm talking about our land use economy if we're going to make this transition. So we've got significant transformation in our foundational economies. Energy, material, nutrients. These baseline economies are shifting. And then I just want to sort of keep pricking a few things. Denmark, I've got a lot of my Danish friends in the room. They all know this. One of the most circular economies in the world, and certainly the global north, right? 4% circular and declining. Right? Now, in that context, it's obviously clear we're doing really well at recycling copper, right? So if you look globally, recycling of copper is really good right now. But net, it's 4%, right? We've got a massive journey to make. And remember, the global south is doing most of the work on recycling. So that's why global average is 7.2%. The net fuel conversation. Now, this, I think, is 2 dimensions to this conversation, which I think is, one is the total energy demand. But how many of you read Ed Conway's book on Material World? Thank you. I'd really do a big shout out for Ed Conway, do a big shout out for Nate Higgins, who does a brilliant energy, he's a brilliant energy he writes, he was a lecturer, but he writes a lot about energy futures. But what you start to see is the scale of the energy dependency to our hydrocarbon system. But it's not just energy, it's also our chemical dependencies. So coal is not only required for energy, it's required for some of the chemical properties it has in some of the conversions that we do in terms of metallurgic effects and other things that we do. So we have dependencies on this hydrocarbon infrastructure of an order of magnitude that is significant. And the biodiversity stuff is fast. Now, I want to I want us to just use this. This was brilliant work done by Demos Helsinki and Citra. And what's useful is all the stuff that's colored in, like use public transport, heat pump, telecommute, buy local food, vegetarian diet, solar, all of that stuff done, we're still left with this. And my purpose of this graph is to show the gap that we have. That strategic gap is of an order of magnitude. So when we start to look at this, you start to sort of talk about all of these realities. One of the things that sort of strikes me, and this is I was talking to potential new government coming into the UK and talking to some of their people and saying, look, they're saying we're going to have to build 350,000 homes. That's the government target. And I'm like, but there isn't the carbon budget. You don't have the available carbon budget to deliver these homes. And it was like, I'm sorry, but we have to, right? Now, that problem is this. All of Europe, I think, can afford to build about 175,000 homes a year if it was to fall within the carbon budgets, Paris Accord carbon budgets. 175,000 homes. We currently have a target of about 1.5 million. So this is a scale of transition we're facing on multiple factors. So even with, and again, I'm using my Danish context as baseline, just because actually they've been doing some great work on actually looking at the kind of the pipeline, the drawdown pipeline that we're starting to see. So if you're looking at 9.6, which is the current emissions of kilograms of carbon per square meter per year, this is embodied and in use over that year, Danish law took it down to 7.1, right? This was done with pulp. We need to get to 0.4 by 29. And all the best schemes that you see, and they're exceptional schemes, are getting you to say maximum 3.6. And the only reason I'm bringing this up is I think it's really vital that we look at the systemic shift that we're facing. And it's going to demand, I think, different things. It's going to demand questions about how we provide comfort. Do we provide comfort by massive oversized buildings as our material investment, or do we reimagine what comfort looks like? How do we deal with efficiency? Schools are 17% utilized. 17.5% is the utilization rate of a school. That means 83% of the time it is unused. What is our moral obligation and our practical obligation of changing the utilization rates of our buildings? And how do we do that? And this is an insurance question, it's a regulatory question, it's those questions that are impeding our capacity. So utilization rates, efficiencies. How do you build comfort standards and reimagine our comfort frameworks? How do you build new typologies? Buildings are still being built as programmatic buildings, Class A office blocks. So you've got an asset class, which is office, Class A, Category A office. You're building to that requirement. We're not building aprogmatic buildings. We're not looking at new balance sheets and valuations of buildings. Look at the embodied carbon, look at the embodied material value, end of use material value. How do you construct this new economy requires some of this work. How do you then build the material circularity of those buildings, which is, again, not just about material innovation, it's about regulatory innovation, it's about the insurance aspects of those buildings and the secondary supply chains. And then all sorts of questions about how you finance this stuff. Like I say, it's as much about pension funds and our investors. How are they investing? What asset class are they investing to? How they're valuing this stuff? All the way through to the bioregional work. And again, there is some great work going on, even in this room, amongst many of you around this work. But it's worth just recognizing the scale. One thing I'd also say, I think we're underestimating the land use transition we're facing. So if we're going to rely on a biomaterial economy, we're going to have to also rely on rebuilding our biodiversity, and we're going to have to rebuild our nutrient base. This is probably one of the greatest transformations at European level, is we're going to have to shift our land use at quite a structural level. And I don't think we're doing that work right now comprehensively enough. So yes, material innovation, but all these other landscapes are part of it. This was quite sobering for me, right? And the reason why it's sobering is you start to look at actually the embodied carbon, and what you start to realize is rammed earth gets you to 7 kilograms. We need to be at 6.3. That's excluding all the associated technologies or any other material supply chain costs to rammed earth, so if all the technology. Why that's interesting is it starts to show you the deficit we have to deal with. Retrofit. We were working on retrofit, and I want to be honest about this. We were working at whole city retrofit, and what we started to realize, we don't have the carbon budgets for it. We don't actually have the material carbon budgets. This is the best retrofit, one of the best retrofits in the UK. 125 kilograms per meter squared of carbon released. Takes 21 years to do a payback. UK doesn't have the volcano of carbon it can throw up into the air to suck it back over 21 years. So how do we deal with this problem? Because we're in a different landscape. And I want to talk about the affordability question here. So many of the questions now are starting to become, how do you afford this new economy? So I used the example, I used it last year, but I think it's just so material, which is a shirt, £45 shirt. The best costs, including water, soil damage, the whole value chain, I've seen it being priced at $250 to $450. 45 goes up to 250 to 450. That's a 5x to nearly a 10x variant. What does a house look like when you did a true cost analysis? I really think we should do a true cost analysis of a house, because I think it's going to challenge all of our theories of ownership. It's going to challenge all of our theories. We don't want a rental economy, because that's going to be basically a rent-seeking economy. We're going to have to think about deep governance into those futures. So again, at a macro level, I think we're moving from, we're going to have to shift our material economy. We're going to have to make it more intangible. We're going to have to drive towards durability. We're going to have to drive towards circularity. We're going to have to move towards biomaterial base. We're going to have to shift our nutrient economy. We're going to have to build the biointegrity. And also often not discussed sufficiently is, what is the new human economy? Because if you look at machine-human relationships, we're probably at the middle of a radical transformation as large as the Industrial Revolution was, or what does the human economy look like? And those interaction points are now happening simultaneously. And what are our intervention spaces? This is what I think is also really critical for me. So certainly in the UK, and I'm using that as an example, working with the Major Projects Association, what's become very clear is construction, you just can't get the labor force right now. Labor force is all moving to either infrastructure or defense. So what you've now got is a labor constraint in the system, and regardless, we're not going to be able to, UK certainly not going to open up the borders in that current landscape. So what we end up with is, where are we going to invest our limited carbon budgets, our limited labor supply, and our limited sort of what I'd call human compute capacity? Where do we invest that? And I think we're going to have to start to think at the infrastructure scale of these transitions. Most of the work we're starting to see is starting to look at novel forms of infrastructure. I don't mean monolithic infrastructure. We were having this conversation. It's not the monolithic infrastructure of one tree canopy of a city. It's the emergent function of 600 urban forests which come together to build the tree canopy of the city. Or it's 40 different energy trusts coming together to build effectively a new energy supply framework towards it. So this is again a global north perspective, but I think it's an important constraint perspective that I think is worth bringing to the table. How do you operate in a near zero build future? What does justice look like? How do you provide that justice? How do you operate in a new material economy? And I found this really just refreshing for me when I sort of was like, okay, that's a really different way of thinking about our relationship with materials. And then we ended up using that to build something around batteries and imagining batteries. And so there's a whole piece of work we're doing around trust intermediaries between suppliers and producers and suppliers, acting as independent public trust intermediaries. How do you do that? And these sorts of new forms of economic arrangements are going to be critical to make sure we avoid rent-seeking scenarios as we move into this new stewardship economy. How do we operate in this new machine-human economy landscape is also a vital part of the transition. So, in a boring way, what I also want to say is that the kind of future of the city isn't the kind of gleaming towers that we see. It's our capacity to do massive micro-interventions at scale simultaneously in a way that I don't think we've done before. It's the aggregative infrastructure transformations rather than the big monolithic. We don't have the material economies for that. That's going to require new forms of innovation in that landscape. And these are, again, work we've been doing in Birmingham, looking at actually what the kind of retrofit looks like, a micro retrofit. And these are painting buildings white. Solar awnings, all the way through to changing energy infrastructures, to greening those infrastructures, to all sorts of micro capacities. Again, I can share the slides later, I won't go through it. But two kind of minor provocations as we close into this. One, I do think this transformation is much deeper than what I would say is the material obvious stuff. I do think this is a fundamental transformation in how we relate to the world. So why stuff like materials being held in a different governance relationship to theories of ownership becomes important is because I think the idea of, this is a bit of a bomb to drop so late in the talk, but theories of property perhaps no longer work as a mechanism of governance. Because who holds the end-of-life liabilities, the system liabilities, the externalities? I think we're going to be challenging deeper fundamentals in terms of our relationship in those things. And that's a bit of a bomb, but we can pick it up later. But I do encourage us to work diagonally, not just through the material economy, all the way down through some of the structures like property. And we're seeing some really interesting innovations coming up. Like, for example, in Halifax, we're working with Indigenous Friendship Centre to make land which is self-owning. Now, why that is important is it changes the theory of where you govern from. You govern from the point of view of the land as opposed to govern from the point of view of a single user or a single property owner. So your governance frameworks change, and there's some interesting things that come up. So, but three challenges I want to focus on that are emerging across certainly what we're seeing. The gap between philanthropy and the market. I think we're about to see that gap really significantly, where I think philanthropy is doing really great work, but the scale of capital required is of an order of magnitude that the market's not ready to pick up. In fact, the market is still valuing the gap between what markets are able to price and where value lies is so significant, recognized but significant. I think we have a real challenge here. And that's going to require novel capital structures. So the things that I'm seeing hope in is there are some philanthropists stepping forward, recognizing their concentration of wealth has been a function of extraction from the wider economy and recognizing they have to give as part of repair. So one dimension. Second dimension is actually investors recognizing, intergenerational wealth stewards recognizing that their significant risks are societal risks. So they're no longer allocating just to philanthropies and go do good, whatever you like. They're saying there are societal risks that we want to pool and manage together. So how do you bring intergenerational wealth stewards together to actually talk about managing societal risks? Third is, I think, there are generations of market makers that are starting to, people that have been at the kind of cusp of making markets, recognizing what they're currently able to price and where value lies in the future is an arbitrage. There is a technical arbitrage available between what the market is currently pricing, where value is likely to move, and who are the market makers that are able to move into that landscape. So I think there's a new pool of capital that's going to have to be intentionally constructed to be able to actually bridge that gap. And I think that gap is significant because the demands are shifting very, very, very quickly. Two, I think democracies face a structural challenge, which is multi-actor innovation, simultaneous coordinated multi-actor innovation. So if you're working on the electrification of Stockholm, a real example, what you get up into a very clear problem is that this requires coordinated intervention by at least an anchor 15 actors. And that coordinated intervention isn't like a boardroom, we just sit together and sort of say, hey, isn't it nice, let's do this together. It's actually like pooling liabilities, building a shared instrument, shared organization, which is actually saying we're going to assign our liabilities and assign our risks to the institution. We're going to pay it to actually manage these risks. So new types of multi-actor institutions are becoming really critical. And I think this is going to be vital for democracies to be able to do this stuff. And this is, in cities work, we're starting to see this becoming a really critical issue and a really critical factor. And three, I would say, like I was saying about materials and the governance and the economics of these materials, I think there's a gap in our foundational R&D, not just research, not the papers being written about new economies, but the research and development of new economic frames into those frameworks. And those are becoming really quite systemic to us. Now, why I'm bringing all of this to a cities conversation is cities sit at the nexus of these transformations. And they are the drivers of demand, not just the supply side of that innovation. So cities can impact all of those supply infrastructures around the world through coordinated intervention. But they're going to require new types of capabilities to be able to do that. So I suppose I hopefully have balanced sort of the darkness and the scale of the conversation with the possibility. But I do want to encourage us that you're here with really incredible people, genuinely some of the best people in the world in many ways. I do think we need to actually do through a structural step change in terms of what's going to be required from us as well. And it's going to require multiple aspects of us coordinated and working together. So my hope, and we're going to open up for a bit of discussion, hopefully, is that we use this forum to build those questions. And these are not exhaustive, please don't think they are. You'll have better questions, better facts, better information points, better innovations. But this is an invitation to at least use this forum to build the relationships, because I think, like somebody put it so beautifully, this is like a wedding. So you sort of come here, it's a family wedding, it's hosted by us with so much care and attention that you can actually have informal, real conversations and be part of that conversation in a really beautiful way. So I'm going to bring it close to here, but I would also, if there's not necessarily questions for me, but if there's points you want to raise into the room, this would be a great invitation. I'll come forward. So if there's any, yeah, totally. Yeah, I'll walk around. Any thoughts? Thank you, Sarah. Thank you for breaking the ice.
Yeah, I think we should just do 5 minutes of applause for you. But thanks. You mentioned being in conversation with labor, I assume, and that was the question that came to my mind, both with last night's presentations and now yours, is really the political dimension of this. And I wondered how you see that aspect of advocacy, given that governance, politics, the city scale, the national scale, where you see points of hope, where you see opportunities for action. Should we have more policymakers in the room at Klosters?
It's a great question. I think, again, but we don't need to make it questions to me. There's just going to be discussion. But the way I'd respond to that, where I'm seeing our allies right now are, and this is really weird to say, but central banks are understanding the stability risks. Second is, weirdly, security services are understanding the stability risks. Third, intergenerational wealth holders are starting to see the stability risk. Who operate, so we've been speaking to one family which owns the largest sugar plantation in the world, and they're starting to talk about, actually our theory of asset management is rubbish. It's not accounting for the risks that we're holding. So longitudinal asset holders starting to think about risk in a different way. And then communities on the ground. This is my one other thing that I've given talks like this sort of talk in Plymouth at a CVS center, community voluntary center, and people feel this on the ground. So one thing I would really plea us with, put a plea here, do not think this conversation is just Westminster and Brussels. Communities on the ground feel this conversation much more viscerally than actually our politicians do. So weirdly, I'm saying our politicians are resultant, and our CEOs even, are resultant forces of these structural risk holders. And these structural risk holders are starting to see the table. City leadership is starting to see some of these interaction points, but like I say, it's moving down the chain, I would say. And the other part is, I'm more and more looking at what does crisis-based transformation look like. And even a potential new Labour government was looking at the idea that manifestos won't hold, but what might be more critical is as crises occur, they'll open up the Overton window to actually drive large-scale change. So how do we use crisis-based transformation as a means of change, I think might be another policy lever. But yes, sorry.
Well, yeah, hey, and thanks for a really interesting presentation once again. And I'm one part of the Danish delegation, and we're doing a project right now which is a follow-up on the reduction roadmap, which is about roadmaps for bio-based construction. And just to confirm, it's very much a land use question. So most of the time we spend with farmers. And just one observation is that you can double the amount of biomass from moving from straw to grass, simply because you use the energy of the sun whole year round. So I think you're really onto something that we need to discuss land use very much. But the question is, it's coming back to this issue of multi-actor innovation. I think for me the best way to do that is to go very local. I come from an island with 40,000 people, and I would really love to do the systemic change on that island, and that island only, because that is a magnitude where we can actually meet all the people around the table. But my trouble then is, when I try to raise attention for that and also try to raise money for that, I can't really make that work, because it is seen as something that is done for the benefit of a deserted area, not something that is done because we could actually take the lead to tackle systemic challenges. So how do we make super local, super attractive?
Good question. I think that's questions for all of you. Land use, I'm going to double down on. I think this will be a big, big issue, and I think we have to think about it quite hard. And I also think that I am seeing quite a lot of hope on this multi-actor innovation stuff. We've had a bank turn up in one conversation saying we're willing to do 0-point financing on the basis that we recognize the risk of electrification is material to the other assets we own. So I think people are starting to think quite systemically, and they're the ones bringing together the industry on that side. So I think there's something interesting going on where people are starting to recognize the idea of pooled risk and pooled balance sheet functions at the institutional level and starting to organize. And that's a real example with a real bank, with real corporates, starting to build some of those. I think we're going to start looking at these multi-actor institutions, largely built through, like in conversations we're having in Sheffield, for example, are how do you bring the hospital, the universities, the colleges, and the municipality together to build a shared pooled infrastructure investment company to deal with strategic risks. So I think people are starting to do these first steps, but I do think there's micro-local, and even business improvement districts are, I think, going to be pivoted into some of those things as well, which is, I think, some of the things. Hello, Sheila. Sorry.
So first of all, you've blown my mind. And I'm trying very desperately to look at where the constituency that I work with, which is about 40% of people who are disenfranchised in the global south, living invisibly, informally, and illegally, and whose whole lives operate on incrementality. So where do all of this fit into this grand plan? Because they represent the majority of the population that has to survive these grand plans in which they have no voice, choice, or any value. And everybody who's an asset holder, whether it's the North versus the South, or in each environment, the rich and the poor, these processes are ultimately going to work for 30% of the population. So your concept of democratization and universalization suddenly produce a feeling of exclusion, because we operate in the dark side of this world, where everything we do is dysfunctional in a futuristic sense. And yet we don't have the bandwidth to participate in. And I look at people here, and I'm trying to think who else shares my sense of despair, and yet amazing energy and capacity to survive that I see with people. So I think we need to expand, because what you're saying is very important, but you have to bring it down for more people to feel they can make a change happen.
I totally agree. And I think the thing I'm worrying about, so when the UK builds 350,000 homes or attempts to build it, it does so by massively constraining the possibility of any form of justice at a planetary scale. That's what it's actually doing, right? So when Germany builds 500,000 homes, that's what it's actually doing. So how do we achieve this constraint is I think a technical, legal, and also a self-survival conversation to actually build the capacity for the global south to actually be able to do the material justice that's required. Without this, I think we're in deep problems. This is my worry is currently we're still driving down the consumption line, which will leave no headroom and will vastly accelerate. And also, I think you're right. The other thing is the conversations. The worrying conversation I've been in a room with, and this is I want to perhaps name it, is that I sat in a room once and somebody said, "Well, look, Indy, 1 billion people are going to survive." And I was like, "What the shit?" And he said, "Well, that's the Earth's carrying capacity. It's 1 billion." And I was like, "No, it's about 7.2 billion." We said, "What do you mean?" "Well, if you just got rid of about 800 million lifestyles, 7.2 billion are just fine." Right? That's the differential way of looking at it. And the problem is that there's no pathway, and that's the conversation I had. They were very nice people. They weren't horrible people. They just had, that was what they were being programmed to think, right? And so what I ended up saying was, but you do realize that if we lose 7 billion people, we're not going to stop suddenly at 1 billion. The level of war we'll set up, and the level of violence we'll set up will become mutually self-terminating. And I think what we have to realize is the fork we're facing, and it's a fork between mutually assured thriving and mutually assured destruction. And this is why the justice component isn't like, oh, I'm being nice. It's not even a moral question, or like, oh, I'm morally feeling better. It's an existential question of survival. And I think the sooner we realize this is an existential question of survival, I think we shift the justice question to a fundamentally different story. And I think then we start to talk about how do you unleash, like James Lovelock does, a brilliant planetary civilization of 8.2 billion intelligences, a planet which is becoming self-conscious and self-aware of an order of beauty that we have not really talked about. So I think there's a path to this, and I think I'm really grateful that you're here, and you're really grateful that you bring this voice. I wish we had more as well, but I think it's really important. So thank you for bringing this. So.
Thank you very much, Indy, for a beautiful, beautiful presentation, and it really made me think. And feeding into what Sheila said, actually my talk was a little bit more, I would say, Nordic, global north, but global south. If you think of the map of connectivity, it is that disconnect from the global south. When you look at the technology narrative globally, it is completely flawed. 1/3 of the global population is not even connected. And when you are disconnected, you do not have a voice in the community. And I like the idea actually brought by the Finns that they said we should make connectivity, being connected, a human right. So if we started there, and we could do so much grassroots if we really distributed those things, people had the tools to communicate, because we could share new ways of system thinking, we could raise the global system level awareness, but we haven't even started to think about that, because we're so disconnected around what people are thinking in the other part of the world. So that's just some thoughts about that, and on your beautiful presentation. Thank you.
No, I really appreciate that. And the one thing I'd add to this conversation is, remember, the global south exists in the global north as well. Right? So actually some levels of poverty in certain parts of the global north are equivalent to what's happening in the global south. So this is not a geographic conversation. And the fact that inequality has become so significant is also destroying the politics for mutuality between the global north and the global south level. This is destroying it. So we are going to have to do this work internally as well as transnationally in deep senses. And I think that requires a level of, and again, for me, this is not a moral argument anymore. Like, it's no longer a moral argument. It's not like, oh, I'm going to be nice. It's an existential argument. And the more we see it from that landscape, I think we start to have a different economic frame. And there's some beautiful frames moving, like the theory of the questions about sufficiency, that which part of our economies do we need to talk about sufficiency from? Which part of our economies do we need to talk about growth from? So we can start to actually have quite different forms of conversations as part of that development. So with that, thank you everyone, and really delighted to be here with you.
Outstanding. Thank you, Indy.